Yeah, the coaching site is solveforwhy.io.
Oh,
And then
okay, okay.
we run an in-person academy that you can attend through. Like we have the online site that's just a monthly subscription. You get training videos. Then there's the in-person academy. And then the podcast is just kind of like a side project that, kind of stems from everything.
What's up, guys? I got someone on here that's got a lot of themes that I like. He's a podcast host. He's a business owner that's helped plenty of poker players get to a better state. He's innovating in the industry. His theme of those podcasts I like quite a lot, which is Solve for Why. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? He's also won in his big challenge against Nick Garibald, who talked loads of shit and ended up embarrassing himself, but paying out in the end and getting beat by Berkey, who lived up to his name. Matt Berkey, that's who we're talking about. Here he is. The first thing, I think, let's talk about the latest scandal, because that's quite a hot topic. And you seem to have a bit of an opinion on it. We made a whole podcast on it, like video. So, well, like barely a scandal, right? I don't think this is cheating to have a laptop next to a poker table, but I don't think it's a great look. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I kind of fall in the minority here, where we all agree optically it's very bad. I don't think anybody wants to promote the main event specifically, the biggest platform that we have to offer. I don't think anybody wants to promote it as a bit of a team sport. But I'm of the mind that looking at pre-flop charts in between hands, and I kind of made this a point also whenever people started freaking out about the use of tools such as GTO Wizard and maybe Floptimal and other things that can offer you pre-flop solutions at the touch of your fingertips. I wanted to be clear that I think we're kind of overreacting a little bit. Of course, there's a little bit of edge to gain there by knowing all these things perfectly, but taking a quick glance in between hands for 30 seconds doesn't allow you to know anything perfectly. It just kind of gives you a little bit more confidence when you're dealing with fringe cases. So when you have hands that are borderline that could go one way or the other, maybe you happen to be able to call back to that chart that you just recently saw and remember that it does this instead of that. And yeah, that's worth something. But let's not pretend that, this is the difference between winning and losing. I would say that just having Dom on the rail in general, in any case, no tools, no laptop, nothing, that is probably worth more to Jonathan in this spot than being able to look at a picture.
So it does make sense. I mean, to have like a whole teammate who's basically a top player, like on the rail and like giving you live support, essentially, is yeah, I can see how that is more an asset. I didn't think of that. I was thinking more along the lines of like, well, I didn't really. I mean, the only opinion was like, this is probably bad for poker. Although it's nice to flirt with the idea to see where it goes. I mean, you make a valid point. I don't see how making like a few tiny pre-flop mistakes on the edge too, like where it's like a tiny difference unless you have like major mistakes. I guess it doesn't matter. I just don't see how it's like gonna like change really the outcome if that's what they're checking, or like a little bit of variation in the post-op play. I will say, I mean, how much do you know about ICM late tournament post-flop play? Because that can actually matter a lot if you're,
Yeah,
especially if you're like not really well versed in it.
no, that's very true. But those sims take quite a bit of computing power to run. So I don't even think that was viable. I don't imagine that they studied ICM spots much beyond the day off, where they were able to study for the full nine. Like as they were playing down, Jonathan's not really going to be able to run to the rail and see what the risk premium is for the low jack, six-handed given the new chip stacks that have just come to be 3 seconds ago. Dom's not going to get that information instantaneously like that. But to be fair, I think that it's important that we prevent the ability for that to change in the future as more computing power becomes available. So I don't think it's great to have laptops specifically on the rail. But I don't want to overreact and get to a point where everybody's phone is sequestered if they need to be there, or suddenly you're not allowed to interact with the audience at all. Like, I think all of these things are very good for poker. Having your friends there to cheer you on, to give you a hug when you win a hand, even to just like calm you down and give you advice that may or may not be worth anything. I think all of that is a big part of the main event experience. And I think that that's the biggest thing we're trying to sell, right? Is that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And optically to the audience, we want it to feel that way. We want it to look that way. So if we're super concerned about making this fair for all involved, I'm not against giving everybody a 30-second timeout. Let them, go to the rail, use it however they see fit. If they have Sims to look at, God bless them, whatever. I know that I'm pushing this to an extreme, and I'm not even suggesting that we do this, but I think it's important that operators and players alike embrace the fact that technology is here to stay. And either we figure out ways to better integrate it, or we let the game perish around us. Like, this notion that we can preserve what once was, I think is a bit silly.
I think there's lots of parallels in the real world, but like the way the tides go, you can't you have to in some ways go with the tide at least, even if you're trying to make a change. You can't go fully against the tide, especially when there's too much leverage to be gained.
You can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's out.
Yeah, well, AI is not going anywhere. I mean, the one obvious parallel, I'm aware of, even in business, that I'm not fully equipped with yet, actually, is AI is going to take over business too. It basically is. People just have to learn how to use it. That's just a fucking fact. I mean, in poker, if you're not already learning how to use it in poker, it's crazy. I hear people sometimes not using Sims or for poker, and I just think it's so fucking stupid that it's like not dieting and going to the gym. It's crazy. I think.
I think that's true, but I also think it's a bit overstated. I think what the vast majority of people will benefit from when it comes to any sort of study, but specifically looking at Sims in some sort of capacity or solved spots, the vast majority of what people are going to take away from that are just heuristics. So most people aren't going to memorize preflop ranges, and honestly, most people won't be well served to, because these ranges are very rigid for the environments that they're ran for. Like, a high rake range is going to look very different than a no rake range. An anti range is going to look quite different than a 3-blind game. And there's no real logical extrapolation between them. You can't look at an anti range and look at a no rake range and say oh, I see how the ante impacts every single position and every single response. I can just logically deduce how to play one format or the other. It really doesn't work that way, and it's always the fringes and the hands that mix that become less than intuitive to us. So I think that because Sims are so rigid to the parameters that you utilize, what most people benefit from is understanding the outputs and how to practically apply the heuristics that the outputs kind of convey. Situations where it's you do want to barrel a front door flush draw, or you don't want to barrel a front door flush draw, and it's all based off of range morphology and how your opponents are reacting and things of that nature. But whenever you're specifically conditioning yourself to play against somebody that also responds, perfectly, you're really setting yourself up for a disappointment when you play against a bunch of people that respond imperfectly. And it's not that they're going to naturally take advantage of you, but in in isolated spots, you're going to leave a lot of money on the table where just using your brain would have done a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like the real power in all this. I mean, the Sims still enlightened for a lot of heuristics, really, that a lot of people miss, especially if you use them in smart ways. Like if you no lock and see like how far away people really are, and with using your intuition, you can't really pull out a ruler and
Yeah.
measure it.
Yeah.
You can find some like pretty big exploits. I'll give a couple examples. I mean, versus like turn barrels and 3-bet pots, like people overfold really hard, or at least used to. People don't have the right sizes in 3-bet pots. People play 4-bet pots all wrong. Huge percent do. There were some real strange spots in 3-bet pots that were not really right, like or at least just play all whack.
I guess what I'm speaking to though is the collective, right? Like everything you're talking about is pretty nuanced. So if you're talking about pooling the top 10% winners and pitting them against one another, then it becomes a lot more critical for them to be able to navigate and read between the lines, right? Try to figure out how to exploit one another and basically rise up the rank in the hierarchy. But when you start to include the total populace, the entirety of people that are playing, the vast majority of people are losing. And for most of them, the biggest benefit they could get is just learning simple game theory principles and like basically how money is made in the game, right? And for that, they don't need to look at a sim. They need to be given good information from somebody else who understands the sim. So I guess like when I think about it from a learning hierarchy, there are the people at the like at the upper echelon that are theorists to the core. They understand and they speak the language of the algorithm, so to speak, right? They understand the why behind a lot of what it does. They realize how EV is generated and exchanged, and they're able to then kind of distill that down into strategies. From there, you have like the interpreter, and this is somebody who's also pretty well versed in the Sims and understands these things at least at a surface level, but they can communicate it into they can convert the math into English, so to speak. And these are like the educators. These are the ones that are passing the message on to the overall collective, which then turns into trends. And you see certain things start to shift along the populace, right? From there, then you just have like the practitioners. These are the ones that just like go out and execute. Like a guy like Jesse Lonis comes to mind. He's probably never looked at a sim in his life, but he obviously has pretty strong foundations in the principles. And I imagine that he speaks to a lot of people who are good at interpreting the sims, right? So they basically communicate the strategy from math into English to him. He understands it. He learns the basic principles, and then he just goes out and executes as he sees fit. And in turn, what happens is his intuition gets kind of trained up. He starts making more plus EV decisions. He's able to adjust according to the player type that he's up against, and he's not really bogged down by the barometer of what the sim would do in a specific spot, which often can become difficult. Like it creates a lot of white noise if you're worried about how the sim would use blockers, but you're playing against a guy who doesn't know anything beyond his two cards.
I agree with that. I agree with that a bit. I mean, it's really helpful to know to be able to rank the bluffs and some kind of way that's feasible, so you're not bluffing like 100% or like 80% in the spot, which will have negative consequences. Specifically, like people will like you have to now like choose take away worse spots where the guys can like overadjust or way more likely to overadjust. So a couple things on that. I kind of agree. I think that will only take you so far though if someone's trying to take the game seriously. Like I looked at quite some. I didn't study that much, but every single time I looked, I always discovered something, and it occurred to me that my perceptions were not as good as I might think, and that, but basically, you could actually like break down the series of situations and then like realize to yourself, okay, I don't know the heuristics in a bunch of these spots, but I'm going to take a look and learn the heuristics and like label these spots in terms of functionality, like how much EV is actually in these spots and how easy it is to fix them, and like just I mean this is useful sometimes. I've used this method a little bit, and then just like go through all of them systematically as you play according to each one's urgency, etc. An example would be There are some spots that are much more valuable than others. It turns out that, for example, button versus small blind three bet is quite important. Um, and like that's a lot more valuable than like button versus under the gun three bet. And so what you do is you would look at that spot first, and then you would like you could create like a watered down version of all the flops and just take a look for like 15 minutes at all the flops, and then decide, and then keep doing that essentially for like the whole game, and then now you've got like a massive base of heuristics to learn from. But the reason why I say this is because it's easy to like miss like some spots where you're missing some value or thinking or everything where you don't. It's like it's not that easy to group a bunch of heuristics based off of like the more less thorough one's strategy is, the more likely there's going to be holes in it. But yeah, you could theoretically like get around all that using someone's intuition to a degree, but you'd still depends how serious you're trying to be, and you need
Yeah,
some
I
talent to
mean,
do that.
I think, yeah, I do agree. You definitely need some talent regardless. And it just matters which way your talent lends itself. For some people, it'll be very analytical and they'll be well served to look at data. They'll be well served to look at sim outputs. For other people, it'll be very much psychological and they'll be well served to just use their observational data and trust it, specifically in the live sphere. And I think like what you're speaking to really matters what environment you're playing in, right? All of what you say is critical to beating any online game. But in most live games, depending upon how reg heavy it is and how studied your opposition are, the formation of button versus small blind three bet as opposed to button versus under the gun three bet, it's probably not going to yield nearly as big of a delta in win rate as it would online, because specifically online, they're three betting appropriately from the small blind. But live, it's just too passive of a formation. Like too often, that spot just gets called, and for that alone, it's less of a reason to delve into this one specific node, and it's more of a reason to generally understand how to pick people apart that aren't hitting the correct frequencies.
So I have two questions or two thoughts. My first thought is you could still use this still method of like constructing like if you're really serious, constructing like a game plan of heuristics of like things to look at and actually apply the sims in this kind of way. Matter of
Yeah, I
fact,
agree with that.
there was a guy that did something like this. I forget his name. It might have been Steve Paul or whatever his name was on Run Once. I actually watched this guy's video. He's like, "This is how you play against VIPs and use the solvers for VIPs with whack ranges." And like basically showed that pot size was like pretty good in a lot of spots. It makes sense to me, and I intuitively, I guess I felt that because I use that size quite a lot. But it still has some practice. But I see how you're right, and you could also like still use some heuristics for like like how do you say reducing the complexity of live play. That might take a bit more creativity and intelligence to figure out. But on that note, what would that look like for you? How would it? Let's just say we're going through how to adjust to live play, because you do actually play in like some of the biggest live games in the world against VIPs, and like this is probably kind of a dream situation. Actually, it's like more valuable in a way than playing against the best players in the world and beating them. So what does that look like for you for adjusting to these players and not necessarily considering what the fucking their optimal three bet percentage is supposed to be?
Yeah, I think it's tricky to quantify because a lot of this just is trust based. That things that I've observed, I can have a high enough degree of confidence to kind of bake it into my parameters, right? But if I just recognize that, and I think that this isn't that crazy of a statement to make, but weak passive players tend to be too tight in the river node, right? So if we just start with that hypothesis, what you'll find is that a lot of your strategies will build out in such a way that you accrue the majority of your value in EV in the nodes prior to the river. So you're doing one of two things. You're either forcing them to be water by the river, which implies that you're taking a much more passive approach on flops and turns. And this will often be counterintuitive because you'll want to do that on board textures that you kind of like as a range advantage type of dynamic you have locked down, like an ace king 5 board, for example. This isn't a board that we're really going to check very often in a formation where we have a big advantage, like say low jack versus big blinds. Very easy range bet board. If we wanted to, we can have two sizes, yada, yada, yada. But if we recognize that our opponents are like folding a 5 way, way, way too often here, and they're folding king X way too often, even to, a less than pot size bet or whatever, then perhaps you can negotiate their range in a way where you're checking more frequently to get them to the river wider, which will lead to larger payoffs, right? If you deem that to be the street where the majority of the money goes in. But what I've actually found is that they're willing to invest a lot of money up front with hands that have showdown value or drawing for the nuts, and then very little money on the river if they don't have a relatively nutted hand. So it actually leads to a lot of more passive river strategies and a lot more aggressive flop and turn strategies. And then you can extrapolate that idea out even further. Well, what about people who don't necessarily arrive at river too tight? The general takeaway tends to be that if you're the most aggressive player in the game, trying to navigate the widest ranges, you get to be the one who puts in the last bet the most often. So like these general ideas are what I want to build framework around. And then I want to use things like solvers and node locking, some range assumptions and things of that nature to try to disqualify the ideas that I have. Because I think that's more important than validating them, right? Like you really want to test where your ideas fail so that you can get to the root reason as to why. Because if you validate them, you don't need to know why they work, right? Like they just work and the machine agrees.
Well, it's for why not, I guess. And then you solve for why. It sounds like, yeah, am I right?
Well, solve for why they fail, I suppose. But yes, either way, I think kind of proving the not case is worth a lot because it forces you to dig deeper. It forces you to question your assumptions. And at the end of the day, that's where you're really trying to program your intuition, right? Like I'm never going to be the kind of guy who digs in so deeply into a solver output that I'm scrutinizing over the suit of a specific candidate or, the sidecar of a particular top pair and things of that nature, right? Like I want to try to simplify as much as I possibly can where I'm able to just classify things based off of average weight, average value, things of that nature, because it's all so range dependent. My range almost doesn't even matter because my opponents are playing their specific cards, and I have some understanding or range awareness of what their overall range looks like when they take certain actions. And that's all that really matters. I could have any two at that point. I'm the one who's operating off of more perfect information. They're kind of just like flying by the seat of their pants.
Yeah, it makes lots of sense to me. I mean, also like checking these tiny permutations is like in terms of time, it's not really worth it. I mean, I personally use some heuristics that are are very difficult to analyze in terms of in the conventional way through like the pure like game theory point of view from like the pure kind of like looking at strategy. But I use some heuristics like a simple heuristic in soft games is you want to test all the points where the range is weak and just keep hammering them. I mean, like that heuristic alone, in my opinion, if someone just applies that, they'll like probably win money very fast as long as their pre-flop fundamentals are pretty good.
Yeah.
Like I use that quite a bit and just see what I can get away with and try not to let them too dialed in on that. There's some psychological ones too that are like virtually impossible to measure, but a lot of these guys are really strong tendencies if they're like winning a lot or if they just lost a big pot and that kind of thing. You can even typify across. I mean, it's a little bit controversial, but I don't see what's wrong with it. But you can typify. This is the word typify. You can at least categorize according to demographic a bit. I found the Asian and European demographics and the American demographics don't all play the same. There's like major differences in values in the way that they think. And it's just kind of impossible to get this from the solver.
That actually, there's actually legs behind that. So culturally, again, like at the end of the day, with poker, we're trying to convert math to English, or math to language, I should say, right? And that's never clean. It's very difficult often to convey mathematical properties into a natural language. So a good example of this, our lead instructor, Matt Hunt, actually is a linguistic major by trade. Like that's what he got his degree in. And one of the fascinating things that he discovered was, so like in the German language, there's no technical word for merge. Like they don't have a German word for the word merge. It's just a made up, yeah, it's just a made up English thing. Like we understand what it means, but like they don't have that word in their language basically. So when it comes to the concept of merging in poker, like this notion where ranges start to bleed in to one another between the top and the bottom, right? Like that kind of middle-y portion of range that often should just be a part of two separate strategies, but sometimes, you know, it blends itself into a polarizing strategy of sorts where maybe it doesn't belong. But even in the solver, we see it occur from time to time, right? They just don't believe in this. Like they don't understand this concept. They don't really apply this concept. So culturally, they just have a different approach to the game. They think about the game very differently because there's this aspect of it that doesn't fit their language demographic. And I'm pretty sure it was German. It might have been Brazilian, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. So it's either Portuguese or German. But in one of these languages, like the term merge just like is not a thing, and that carries over across different genres, across different cultures, right? Like poker is much newer in Brazil than it is in America, right? Poker is a lot newer in China than it is in other European countries, even though it's probably been around now pretty strongly for like 10 years. But you're going to find that these different cultures are going to be in different modes of thinking based off of how much exposure they have and where the exposure comes from, right? Like personally, my first exposure to the game was just like insane gambling. And so it's no surprise that the framework through which I built how I see this game is like just a giant game of chicken of who's going to give up last, right? So it's just running equities to their extremes and figuring out ways to play the widest ranges and give the most action and play the largest pots. And, you know, that has its pros and its cons. But the point I'm trying to get across, I guess, is there's no black and white way to just stylistically approach the game. I think for a long time, we miscommunicated what the notion of GTO was, and we sold it as a singular strategy that was the most optimal approach to playing no limit hold'em. But truthfully, it's just a stylistic approach that is embodied by the framework of game theory, and it's often changing, right? Like what was quote unquote game theory optimal as we understood it in 2016 is going to look very different now in 2024. So it's really just a nonsense term that's an umbrella idea for a stylistic approach with your core philosophy for how you study the game. But there are many, many, many different angles through which you can find an interest in this game, hammer down on a specific philosophy or lens through which you see it, and get really good at that.
Well, I mean, my personal, I think I mostly agree. I would presume that GTO is just the attempt to like find, like it's going to keep evolving based on software or whatever, although it should converge to, I mean, it will work. It will be basically unbeatable. It just won't be optimal for, you know, trying to maximize actual money for sure in
Right.
a lot of different amounts. Like that, I mean, I think that's what you're trying to say, right? That it's not optimal for like actually winning money.
Well, also
Awesome.
it's no, it's not even that. I'm not even trying to poke holes in the approach. I'm trying to say that it's actually not specific. The idea of game theory optimal is an idea, right? It's an equilibrium that we can't see, feel, or touch. We haven't come anywhere near converging on it. So calling things GTO are just kind of nonsense, right? Like we're all doing different experiments in the lab, so to speak. We're all arriving at different equilibriums. We're all converging on different things based off of different parameters. So there is no vision over the one uniform optimal strategy within this game. And there probably won't be anytime in the near future. Once there is, the game will cease to exist. So I guess like I'm just functionally saying that the language that we use matters, and the notion of portraying anything that feels or at least adheres to game theory being theoretically sound or principled, calling it game theory optimal is kind of like nonsense.
Uh, okay. I mean, I live with that. I mean, I just think it's like the pursuit of like the perfect, like, well, unbeatable games, put it that way. But I could
Yeah,
totally see that people come at it from different angles. I mean, matter of fact, I'll just throw out a bit of one that I noticed was that the way the Chinese respond to tilt themselves as individuals and also the people that respond to them, the people that are playing against them, is very different from how Americans respond to tilt and actually tilt for the most part. I mean, maybe this is less true in VIP games, and maybe that's part of the difference. But like in my experience, the Chinese tended to be a bit more aggressive when they tilted, and also didn't like to fold against tilters, or not so much the Chinese, but the Asians. And maybe this was just. I think this is really a bit of a cultural thing, and just where their lens is at. Whereas the Americans actually tended to go a bit of the opposite route. Particularly the regulars, anyways, that I played against. But I'm sure there's the VIPs and plenty of counter examples both directions. But that's one thing that one weird caveat of like the psychology of how it evolved through the lenses of the whatever the was going on in
yeah,
Asia. It's, the way they play is actually a bit different. It's wild. There's some definitely big differences.
yeah. I could see that. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily a cultural thing or if it's individually based, but um, I think the more mature a market is in general, the
Mhm.
differently people will psychologically react because they become more conscious and more aware of how money is being passed around. And you could even say this on an individual basis. The more experience a person has, the differently he'll react to tilt. Like when I was young and dumb and didn't know any better, the more tilted I got, the more aggressive I got because that was the easiest way to bloat pots and to win money back. As I got older, the more self aware and conscientious I became of the fact that when I'm not tilted, I'm able to get away with a lot of aggression because people are afraid. When I am tilted, that fear factor goes away. And now they start playing and responding much more appropriately to unbridled aggression. So I expect bluffs to get picked off at a higher frequency when I'm obviously being emotional. And I think that that is probably going to be true in general marketplaces as well. Like if poker is new to a region, you're probably going to see a lot more of the immaturity. If poker is pretty well established, like it has been in America, you're going to see a myriad of responses, but most of them are probably going to trend gambly in the passive sense. They're going to try to play more bingo. You know, they're going to enter more pots and try to flop more hands, but they're less likely to try to bulldoze people off of things.
I'm going to veer this off into a non-poker direction for a second, but I do want to talk about more about poker stuff. There's actually a GTO of social behavior, and what you're describing does exist in a lot of different cultures in a few different ways. Matter of fact, and it exists actually. What the kinds of at least something that I've noticed is that what you're talking about has with the inefficiency of like business, etc. And actually, with kind of how poker businesses run, believe it or not, has it has gone in the direction of conscientiousness quite a bit, particularly in America, but not in all cultures, as it turns out. But basically, a business is a lot healthier now than it used to be in poker and in America. I don't know. Well, I guess I can't prove that it is for America, but I think there's a lot of healthy business practices these days for it. But yeah, this isn't true worldwide uh, for other places where, for whatever reason, they haven't matured and adopted, but has had some negative consequences. That particularly, the GTO of social behavior and of how this permeates through all the dimensions of life is more my interest stuff. Do you? I don't want to get too far into that right now, but is that a topic of yours that you're into?
Yeah. When I first started Solve for Why in 2016, one of the more interesting people that I had been paying attention to and reading a bit of was Simon Sinek. Um, he had the Start with Why book, which was pretty impactful. But shortly thereafter, I think 2018 or 2019, he released a book called Infinite Game. And the idea behind it is that there are short-sighted thinkers and there are big picture thinkers in pretty much all markets. And the short-sighted thinkers are most interested in taking advantage of near-term inefficiencies. So they're the smash and grab type of people as they approach any sort of marketplace, right? They want to come up with an idea that maybe solves a problem here and now, even if it creates further problems down the line. They don't really care because they'll just get paid for the solution that they provide now, and then they'll get the fuck out. And I think poker is like the perfect sandbox for this because on the surface, it's a zero-sum game where you're heavily incentivized to max exploit as fast as possible, get all the money that you possibly can, and then get out and move on to bigger and better things. And I think there are a lot of people in this space who do have that mentality. I mean, I don't want to go so far as to name names, but like just pay attention to social Twitter or to poker Twitter. And I think what's
Wait,
that?
why not? I mean, why not name names?
Because I think it's, at least from my point of view, it's not a redeeming quality. Yeah, to be that exploitative, to kind of, because in poker you're not just doing it to an entity or in the guise of a game or a mechanic, right? It extends out to the people that you're affecting.
That, by the way, is the ultimate goal of mine: is to filter out all the people that do these selfish things, let them handle stuff with themselves, and all the good ones live happily ever after. I personally believe in
Yeah,
that solution.
I agree with you. And I mean, for what it's worth, poker is like a very beautiful sandbox for life in that regard. Things often do find a way of ironing themselves out. As much as I think all of us detest the fact that like high stakes have trended towards private and things of that nature, it does make it a lot more policeable where you're able to keep these people out. For instance, here's an example of just that mindset of being short-sighted. I know somebody who used to have access to playing bigger games that would run it once when they were in position and run it twice when they were out of position. Reason being is that you get the extra chip when you're out of position. So
That's yeah, okay.
right. So they're making probably tens of big blinds per hundred by doing this, especially in a same blind game like a 100-100 game. You have a really big win rate. It's actually quite a big edge to do this way, right? But obviously, it's disobeying the kind of gentleman's code that everybody's operating under, and now you're kind of ruining it for everybody. So the bigger thing I'm trying to point to is that on the surface, poker looks like that's what it demands. It appears as though, especially with rake and everything else, that actually makes it almost a negative sum game for 90+%. It appears as though this is what's necessary to sustain yourself, to win, to make money, etc. But my counter argument to that, and I think the articulated point that Simon Sinek gets across in Infinite Game, is that the growth mindset of thinking of it as an infinite game where cooperation and kind environments actually outperform the exploitative wicked environments yields to more growth. And when there's more growth potential, there's basically more fruit on the vine for everybody who's been a sustaining member of that community to eat from. So though in the near term you won't make nearly as much, you'll make money longer for a more sustainable period of time if everybody can get on board with this mindset. And now all you guys have to, or not all you guys, but now what the market has to worry about is just the attrition rate or the turnover at the bottom. So you make it attractive, you make it appealing, so there's constantly an inflow of new interest. And I think that's where the growth of poker comes from. I think that's where the popularity kicks into play. Uh, all of that would be for naught if everybody at the top took this heavily exploitative, short sighted, wicked approach where instead of shearing a sheep, we were trying to skin it every time we had the opportunity.
Right. Well, by the way, you just like literally like basically defined my own like lately life purpose, which is I realized this and also decided how do I apply this in on a grand scale. And then I realized, oh shit, actually poker has a perfect use case for this. The poker actually has a lot of the right things, like exactly you can see these principles in real time, experientially through poker and see it happen. That's what happened to me was even on like levels that I didn't expect. Like I could see how people evolved and got better, which was really quite inspiring. Like I saw a lot of people evolve and get better. I saw how like various bad habits that I had to change and all of that. But yeah, you like nailed exactly why I made this podcast and did all these things and like brought up this topic because like this is not
Yeah,
just true in poker. This is true in everything and veers right off into spirituality.
right.
Um,
It's a use case for sure. Are you familiar with? I think his name is Nick Case.
no, I don't know this one.
Okay, so he's a game developer, programmer, whatever, and he created this game called The Evolution of Trust. And I believe the site is ncase.io, but I'm not sure. I think you can just Google Evolution of Trust.
I played
But
this.
it's basically this concept played out through an algorithm, and it characterizes the exploitative actor versus the good faith actor, and then like the whole spectrum in between. The people that are influenced by the exploitative actors, the people who are influenced by the good actors, and the long and short of it is that no matter how many iterations you run, there will be periods of time where the greedy exploitative actor will overtake the populace. But so long as enough good actors remain, eventually they will have more. They'll have more influence over the masses to flip it until eventually, you land in a utopian society where everybody falls in line. And essentially it's like the prisoner's dilemma. There are two equilibriums. There's the most exploitative equilibrium where both players in the prisoner's dilemma always flip on the other person, and then there's the cooperative equilibrium where both players actually do better by cooperating, but it requires a level of trust.
And it makes loads of sense to me. I mean, also this plays out. I mean, this is where, without getting too like whatever, this is where spirituality and logic actually intertwine. And actually, there's a YouTube video. I need to find the link, but basically, it's the game theory of what's it called? Basically, the game theory of social interaction. But it turns out that the optimal strategy is, in fact, tit for tat strategy, which is basically um, and and it's basically you do good to someone, you actually should be as good as possible. In fact, it outperforms strategies of like laying under the surface to try to them later for a big amount, which was nice to see because I didn't know that that was going to happen or not. But the pure like have pure intentions and then like re- and then keep returning it unless the other side does something up and then you retaliate. You're supposed to retaliate actually. So as a matter of fact, and I've seen this play out actually in the real world. It's like bit of a thing where I like kept testing. I was like, okay, do I just let it go or do I retaliate? Like, apparently it's GTO to retaliate if people do up shit. And I see you're getting into the streets and fighting motherfuckers on Twitter a little bit. Thank God, like everyone's such a bitch in poker, it pisses me off. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah. So hopefully we get some time to talk about that. But anyway, so it turns out that that alone is not perfect because what can happen is that some bad information, which is perfect information is not perfect and whatever, and other people can come in, can be injected into the system, and it can create a cascading effect of retaliation, which is war essentially. That's what war is, or especially if it keeps growing, that becomes war. And you can see this play out in like thug films and stuff. But the only way to fix that is essentially something like self-sacrifice or mercy, like these kinds of things, or what that would play out with in the game theory. Um, I'll have to find the video. It's pretty,
It's very
cute, but
similar to this. Yeah, it's very similar to this simulation that I'm speaking to. Like there are characters that represent tit for tat. There are characters where you have to exploit them twice before they retaliate, and it goes on down the line. But the idea is the same. The logic still prevails. Where by nature, social creatures want to cooperate, even when hierarchies exist. There's just more order that way. And by nature, like tribes want to push out the bad actors. So it's not that crazy of a premise. It's just we're so siloed in poker where we only see the game mechanics and what earns us money. Now, like even when you're talking about studying Sims, right? These are all isolated incidences that we're studying in a vacuum. Like there's no consideration for greater context of, well, it was actually the main event final table and this is a one of one opportunity or whatever the case may be. There's no context for future game simulation, at least not that we can really get much oversight on now. uh, and I think what ends up happening there is people get too hyper focused on what's making the most amount of money in that particular moment rather than what yields the most amount of good either for the individual or the collective.
at some point it occurred to me that my own predilection for money was like kind of arbitrary if you think about it. So it wasn't like, you don't make more happiness EV after like that much money. And it's like, well, why are you making money? And like, what is the future game simulation? You know what I mean? Well, what is like, at some point your social behavior, how kind you are matters to making money, or uh, what situations you are, or like maybe you care about doing something else and this creates more EV, etc. And At some point it occurred to me that it made sense to aggrandize, not it's aggrandize points as they might say, but more like points in the form of doing positive impact versus money. It makes sense at some point where like all your needs are taken care of and all that. But I think that a lot of people won't really understand that idea too much as they're trying to scramble for rent and trying to become financially free. As
I
my
mean,
personal guess with players.
well, you're just describing Maslow's hierarchy, right? The bottom two rungs of the hierarchy are fulfilling your basic needs: food, water, shelter, clothing, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where most people just get trapped. It's trapped isn't even the right word. It's just the plight of most people's lives that they're going to struggle to fulfill those needs, those basic needs. It's not until you graduate outside of that financially and socially where you start to develop love for oneself, love for another, and then you can start to breach the path to enlightenment, right? But you need to be able to clear the way by fulfilling all these other basic human needs before you can actually project yourself out into something that's maybe more impactful to the world. And we're all very lucky. Like, your situation, my situation, we're all incredibly fortunate. We hit a fucking one in a million shot to get to play a game where we're financially free. We have all this time and money on our hands to do whatever it is that we need. So I think the pull to being conscientious and wanting to leave some sort of impact either on your close little community or on society as a whole is it demonstrates deeper thought. It demonstrates an understanding and a burden that one should accept whenever they're lucky enough to be chosen in life. Like we didn't have to end up here. We could have very much been a part of the collective that's also struggling to make rent.
It's totally a fair point. It certainly inspires me and many others. Related to that, I would like to talk about, is that what, I mean, by chance, are you trying to do something like that with Solve for Why and your coaching community? I'm curious what made you decide to start your coaching program and the podcast?
Yeah, I mean,
No.
I guess I guess the best laid plans of mice and men, you know. I think ultimately, again, I was very influenced by Simon Sinek. I believe in like his messaging and overall philosophy. And at the time, I was playing the biggest game in the world in Ivy's room. I was making more money than I knew what to do with, and I was only getting to play like 500 hours a year. So suddenly, I was no longer a full time grinder, but I was making 10x my best year previously. So I'm financially free. All of a sudden, I'm getting returned a bunch of time, and I just felt a very strong pull to doing something bigger and more impactful. The idea of interjecting why behind things to me was a very powerful notion, and I thought it could scale beyond poker. I thought poker was a great testing ground, right? Like, because at that point in 2016, there weren't a lot of sims. People weren't very studied. It was just a lot of observation. And what I realized was a lot of the work that I had done for myself was just identifying why I did what I did, right? So it was literally sitting down on Google Docs and writing long hypotheses and theses as to why the game moved the way it moved, why I took actions when I did, et cetera, et cetera. And that purpose behind my decisions was enough to formulate a strategy and make me be confident in it and win doing it. Now, compared to today's game theory based strategies, was it great? I don't know. Probably had some things right and had some things wrong. But versus the population back then, it was crushing. And that's all that really mattered. The idea behind forming the company was I wanted to learn business first and foremost. I wanted to give back in some sort of capacity to the arena that I felt so blessed to be a part of. But finally, I wanted to build something that could scale outside of these four walls and potentially solve problems elsewhere. It's like, from my perspective, there aren't many people better at problem solving than long-term winning professional poker players. We're just kind of built different to see our way through the chaos. Now, has all that come to fruition? Not even fucking close. Like, I learned a lot of things. Business is very hard.
I got a question, actually. But I don't know if you know this or not. It depends on your relationship to the coaches and all that at Solve for What, or excuse me. Wait, what's the name of your exact site?
Yeah, the coaching site is solveforwhy.io. And then we run an in-person academy that you can attend through. Like, we have the online site that's just a monthly subscription. You get training videos. Then there's the in-person academy. And then the podcast is just kind of like a side project that, kind of stems from everything.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's what I figured. I was curious. One question I meant to ask you. I don't know how much time you have if you got to go, but I wanted to ask, like, what are like the star like content or programs of Solve for Why? Because I feel like everyone's got. I mean, I don't know. Maybe like which ones people really like to sign up for that show that it gives them a lot of progress in a specific area, or they do really well.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, you're right. Everybody has different course loads, and they're all going to be some derivative of one another. Andrew Brokus and Matt Hunt are by far our star coaches. The content that they put out is fantastic. They put out 3 or 4 courses a year. It applies to all arenas, all stake levels. I can't recommend them enough. But really, the unique thing that we have that nobody else does is Poker Out Loud, which is it's a live game where the players are basically conveying their thoughts in real time while wearing noise-canceling headphones. So when it's your turn to act, you say, this is my strategy for this specific spot, and then you take the action. And that happens for all 6 players at the table. We're able to get inside the minds of what people are actually thinking in real time. So it's basically like a play and explain that you would see on many other sites. The difference being that it's live and you're able to hear the thoughts of all the opponents at the table. So you're able to hear not just the strategy of the hero, but you're able to hear the counter strategies of the opponents that they're up against. We marry that with a second piece of content called On Second Thought, where myself or one of the other coaches hand select some of the more interesting spots from the season, and then we compare the in-game thinking between two players to the actual solver strategy, counter strategy. So we get to see how close to baseline these guys are operating.
Cool. I mean, I think that's a cool resource. It sounds kind of fun, actually, in comparison to like this straight solving the going to the solvers. All that's gamified. It's not like running a drill, which I thought was a useful way of doing things, but it's kind of obvious when it talks about uh, coaching, like how hard it is to create some drills. But that seems cool.
Yeah.
Okay, it's more interactive. Like I could see that being, yeah, a really fast way to learn for like somewhat advanced students, I would say.
Yeah, I think it speaks to a wide array of people because for a lot of entry level players, studying is very boring. It's overwhelming. So this is kind of a way to be spoon fed study while you're being entertained. At a bare minimum, it gets people thinking, right? It allows them to get exposed to people who are more knowledgeable than them and the framework through which they see the game. And sometimes that can be enough to light a fire, to want to examine more. And then, yeah, you're right. For people who are a lot more studied, they can hear an in-game thought and they can immediately say, like, oh, I don't like that. Like, I think he should be doing this, that, or the other. And they can compare it to the sim and kind of get real-time answers. It's like, imagine if when you're watching the World Series broadcast, rather than listening to Lon and Norm, you could actually just get inside the head of the player. I mean, that would be miles ahead more engaging. No offense to Lon and Norm. It's just actually getting to hear why they're doing what they're doing is just really worth the price of admission.
So, guys, definitely give that a shot and see if you like it. It seems more, it sounds way more fun than studying. I wanted to talk about like some more scandal stuff.
Also, we're doing a big podcast on Monday. There was a lot of suspected live cheating this summer. Basically, over the last year and a half, there's been a syndicate of these cheaters that are kind of going around. They've been spotted in Cyprus, LA, Florida, Vegas, the Bahamas, Korea, and a handful of other spots, Macau. So far, based off of like sharing information amongst people who are playing high stakes, there's 7 to 10 people, mostly foreigner guys that look like recreationals that have easy access to these games. And what they're using, we expect, or we suspect, is they're using like a pinhole camera. So, and they're having a device on the felt or on the rail. So either a dummy phone or an AirPod case. One person had it in their jewelry, in a card protector. Any of these will suffice. It catches the dealer's pitch. So they have perfect information on everybody's hand. That then gets relayed back to them through an earbud. And now they basically just get to play according to knowing most of the players' hands, if not all of the players' hands. And they've been actually pretty easy to, well, that's not fair to say. They've been hard to catch because they're recreationals. So they've been getting a lot of action. And a lot of it's in shorthanded games, so they're already expected to be playing a lot of hands, so that doesn't look super suspect. But ultimately what ends up happening is they just like never lose at showdown. They're just like not very good cheaters, to say the least, and they're very greedy. So yeah, we've caught maybe like we've caught maybe like a half dozen of them. Obviously, we can't go public for a lot of reasons, safety concerns, as well as we don't have perfect proof. So don't want to accuse people that we can't back it up with tangible proof. But it's just more of an awareness thing where anybody playing in like high stakes cash games, high stake MTTs that have small fields, this is all relevant information to pay attention to. And ultimately, what I want to try to have happen is to promote some change at the operational side where, number one, we're not allowed to have any devices on the rail or on the felt. And this includes like keys or card protectors or sunglasses or jewelry or anything of that sort. And then number two, this is the more important one in my opinion. I'd really love to see dealers switch to a Euro style pitch where the card never leaves the felt.
those changes are made. They seem like they'd be good for the game. The only thing I have to wonder is just like I don't really understand why we're like protecting the cheaters, like you know what I mean, or protecting people who do bad things in the sense of like it seems like they can just go. This is what I was talking about. And this is why I started outing people because like there were just no consequences for cheating, and there just have to be consequences, and there has to be some layer of protection. I mean, it has to be humane or like within
Well,
reason.
think of it this way. Think of it this way, Jungle. Think of it this way. Do you remember the high stakes Euro guy that was found dead in a river in Slovakia? Yeah, I think he was a Swedish player. He was ultimately murdered by like, I think he was murdered by a Swedish. Yeah, he was murdered by like a Swedish biker gang or something like that.
No. I know like the details of the story. At least we don't know that he was murdered, but it's suspected that something was happening. But
Okay.
I don't think he did anything. I don't know what he did to deserve it, though.
Me either, but that's not the point. The point is that there are a lot of dangerous people that are attracted to high stakes gambling, and I don't think any one of us want to be put in the position to be martyrs. It's much better served to just police the game within its four walls and not turn this back into 1970 where we're all carrying revolvers around everywhere we go.
I think we're a little bit far away from that. I think we're not trying to take on the mafia. We're just trying to take on fucking low life cheaters that we're just trying to not even like ruin their lives. Really, it's just trying to protect the community. That's the grand theme of what that to me is the end picture of what I'm aiming for. Is the good people stay together and the bad ones go and themselves. That's I mean I'm being a bit harsh, but I think that's the only solution to all these sorts of problems is basically, but you still have to like identify who's doing something bad and then just like push them away. Essentially, if they do more bad things, then you have to do more than push them away.
Yeah, that's fair. I gotta run.
Okay, yeah. All right. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the time as well. And I'll see you later.
Anytime. This was great. We'll do it again.